Hey, it's Sean from the Commander's Brew. The Brothers War is out and it brings us a whole bunch of new legendaries and a whole bunch of versions of Urza and Mishra. They are the brothers after all. I'm going to try to give you a quick take on all the new legendaries. Some will be super quick and not all that deep. Consider these jumping off points to maybe start your own brew, or maybe these are little sneak previews of a future episode I'm going to do on one of these. I've got them all outlined in the chapters below so you can skip ahead to whichever ones you like. I just have to start with a little bit of business. I'll keep it short, I promise. Hitting the subscribe button goes a long way, I'd appreciate it. Comments, likes, all that stuff. Another way to support directly would be through patreon.com/commandersbrew. Find out how to get in on the Discord. Lots of sweet brew and action happening over there. If you're planning on buying cards, you can click the TCG player link below. And if you're a Canadian viewer, I've got a coupon code from a Canadian card store, the Wizard's Tower, and now 2 ads, a fake one and a real one. Do you have little kids? They're gonna love the Darksteel Industries children's album by the Phyrexian 5. With the classic song, I like to compleot, Eoples, and Bnianias. And other hits like... Order now to get all these songs on 7 cassettes or 4 CDs. And now, the real ad from the Wizard's Tower, wizardtower.com. A super fun website where you can get all sorts of great articles and stick texts. And if you're watching us from Canada, you can use coupon code BREWUNITED to get 5% off your Magic singles. As long as you spend $20 or more, ask your parents for $20. And now, back to the show. Okay, let's get started. Now, some of these legendaries come from the normal set you can open in packs, and some of them come from the commander decks. I'm going to lump them all together, and I'm going to go color by color, starting with monocolored, then multicolored, ending with the most color. Let's start with mono white. Loran, Disciple of History. It's an uncommon mono white commander, so I'm not expecting a ton from it. It does a little something, but honestly, it's a little bit like Tashar at home. That's Chiefy's joke. Thank you, Chiefy. Then we've got Loran of the Third Path. I never heard of you, Loran. How come you got 2 cards? This is more interesting. We've got a little bit of a removal spell in the command zone, and we can do some card draw. I don't love that it's you and an opponent drawing a card, but that could be fun for politics, and we could always break it with something like Spirit of the Labyrinth. We'll just use the ability after our opponents have drawn a card for their turn, and here we are, the only one drawing. Myrel, Shield of Argive. This is a pretty powerful commander. I love that little bit of protection so no one can do too much stuff while it's my turn, and I think you have to pretty much go with a soldier tribal thing. The wider we go, the wider we get. Interestingly, we don't have to be attacking with those soldiers to get more soldiers. It's Myrel that has to attack. So as long as we put a bunch of ways to protect Myrel to get multiple attacks in, we're just going to keep doubling our army. I think a card like Mobilization would be excellent because giving all your creatures vigilance is massive in a multiplayer format. This allows us to attack with the huge wide board, let a bunch of them die, and we still have as many as we need to chump with. And someone like Daru War Chief, just making all of our soldier spells a little bit cheaper and pumping up the whole team. Let's talk Sanwell Avenger Ace. This is a mono white commander from the commander decks. You can tell by the old border. So on the surface, I think we're going to want to make artifact creature tokens or just artifact creatures in general so that we can prevent the damage being dealt to our commander when we attack. And every time we do tap Sanwell for attacking or for crewing a vehicle, we're allowed to cast another vehicle or artifact from whatever we flipped over. Since we have to cast it after we've revealed it, we can't really take advantage of untapping Sanwell and retapping him to get a bunch more cards. Maybe that's why it's not an actual draw, but I think we ought to look for artifact creatures with a little bit of evasion or something good, like Signal Pest. Get a little bit of a battle cry, and then this thing's hard to block. And then if we have something like Lochiel Clockwork Scholar, now we're preventing all the damage to our commander and all those artifact creatures we're attacking with, plus a little bit of extra card draw. Now I think we do want to go wide with tokens of Thopters and Servos and just go as wide as possible and keep swinging. Now let's go into some mono blue legendaries. Drafna, Founder of Lat-Nam. Most interestingly, being able to copy an artifact spell to get a copy of that artifact is pretty cool. 3 mana is a lot to pay for it though, so if we wanted to copy something like a Solemn Simulacrum, which is a cool thing to have 2 land on the battlefield at once, but we would need 7 mana to pull that off. I do like that we get to return an artifact to our hand, so we can play that Solemn Simulacrum early, and then when we have the mana, which we will have ramped a bit by using it, we get to return it, cast it, and copy it again. But we can get a lot more value out of it if we can make our artifact spells cheaper. If we're able to copy a Foundry Inspector for 6 mana so that we have 2 of them out, Now all our artifacts cost 2 less. So now our Jorah's Familiar costs 2 as a base, plus 3 to copy it. Now everything's 4 cheaper. And then we got to take a page from last week's episode. That was the Henzi deck where we were all about making artifact creatures as cheap as possible to blitz them in for free, just oodles of value. You can check it out here. So if we can make our artifacts cheap enough, we can have a scrap trawler out and then just keep looping a commander sphere, which sacks itself, bringing back a wedding invitation, which sacks itself, bringing back a soul guide lantern, which sacks itself, and then we can drop them all back onto the battlefield for free. Loop that a couple times. Hurkyl Master Wizard. This is a paragraph. So once per turn at our end step, we get to reveal some cards and draw one of the types we actually cast this turn. And it can't be a creature, and lands aren't cast. So it's instant, sorcery, artifact, enchantment. Out of 5, we can realistically expect to hit 1 or 2 of those, maybe 3 if we're lucky. But then by that point, we're making the deck as even of a split of those types as possible. I don't need to tell you that we prefer instant spells over sorceries, but then it's at our end step, so we will have had to have cast an instant on our turn to flip into another instant. This is a tricky one. Then we got Urza, Powerstone Prodigy. Obviously, we want to loot away an artifact to get a Powerstone token. Powerstone tokens are interesting because the only restriction is that you can't cast a non-artifact spell, but we can activate all the abilities we want. And since we're going to want to have a ton of artifacts in the deck anyway, I think we'll be able to generate them once per turn. Maybe more if we really focus on it with things like 1000-Year Elixir and other ways to untap Urza. But then something like Phyrexian Triniform becomes great in the graveyard. Encore is not casting. That's an activated ability that we can use for Power Stones. It's a moot point though, because this thing's an artifact anyway. I wonder if it's worth ramping as much as we can with this. I don't know. Let's move on to some mono black cards. Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. There's the altar. Nice. Honestly, I think this one's got to go on the 99. Although if this were your commander, she'll come down pretty cheap. Making a bunch of sackable tokens in black is pretty trivial, so we'll be able to ramp every turn. I do think it's a little bit overcosted to pay 5 to get that 3/3 zombie. I do think Ashnod is very well positioned in something like a Luris deck though. This is Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor. This is very interesting design. I'll start with the ability. 7 mana is a hefty cost, but we effectively get to dump our hand, let's say 4 cards, and we're going to exile 4 cards from an opponent's library, and we'll kind of play those cards. We're allowed to play lands, but we are restricted by how many lands we're allowed to play in a turn. But I think we're going to be getting a deal on that 7 cost. We'll definitely flip more than 7 mana value. And here's why the design's pretty cool, because you would think your opponents would want to destroy this thing right away, never let you activate it. And that's probably true, but there is an advantage to your opponents by letting them stick around. Your opponents can draw cards by doing combat damage to your other opponents. I don't know how many people that will actually persuade to let this thing live, but maybe you could strike a deal. Seems fun. Now let's go over the mono red commanders. This is Farid, Enterprising Salvager, from the commander decks. Okay, this is fascinating because they've introduced scrap tokens. Whenever one of our non-token artifacts goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, we get to make one. So we can't turn things like treasures or clues into them. But it's another one of those little trinkety artifacts. It does literally nothing except it's eligible to be sacrificed and it counts as an artifact for other stuff. That just tells you how important these little artifact tokens are. I want scrap. And I can think of a ton of decks that just want to generate a lot of scrap. So I think Farid is going in the 99 of millions of decks. On their own, it's a little tricky. Goading a creature is cool, but I'm not sure if I want to spend 2 mana every turn to do so. There is a potential to make this thing into a Voltron by putting a bunch of artifacts and equipment and adding the +1/+1 counters. But here we're at another thing where, like that other deck, you want to get that scrap trawler, you want to make artifacts cheap, and you want to loop things that sacrifice themselves that cost 3, then 2, then 1, etc. Because if we can get the cost down to 0, it's like putting them straight back onto the battlefield, and this time we're making more scrap. And at that point, I think we pull out an Inspiring Statuary, so now we can use all that massive amount of scrap as mana. It just has to be for a non-artifact spell, like, I don't know, Comet Storm. So here's Feldon, Ronom Excavator. He can't block, and we want him to take some damage. Giving him haste means we can turn him sideways the turn he lands, but I also don't think our opponents will be blocking him to avoid giving you those triggers. They can easily take 2 a bunch. And you might think you could Voltron this thing, but I really don't think that most Voltron commanders end up dying from damage. They either do their thing or they get removed. No peeking at cards that way. Best I can come up with right now for this quick take is something like a Pyrohemia. Just paying a red to do 1 damage to all the things, including Feldon. He can survive, buff up his toughness, and you can do a bunch more with that Pyrohemia. Keep the board clear as well. So then at that point, maybe it makes sense to use him as a Voltron commander. Who knows? Mishra, Excavation Prodigy. Let's do the math. 3 to cast, and you've got haste. Then you pay 1 and tap to discard to draw a card. And as long as it's an artifact card, you get 2 mana back. This triggers only once each turn. So we paid 4, we looted, and we got back 2. It's like it only cost us 2. But then in the future, we get to profit 1 mana by doing so. I had a look, there aren't any artifacts that have madness, so we won't be discarding them that way. And there is only a small handful of eligible artifacts that have cycling, so there's not a ton to do that way. I do think this goes very nicely with cards like Thrill of Possibility. We can cast Thrill of Possibility for 2, and as long as we discard an artifact card, we'll make that 2 mana back. That seems pretty decent. I imagine a Mishra deck would look a lot like all those other red artifacts that come in and out of the graveyard type of decks, like your Bosches or your Dorettis, that kind of thing. Artifacts are a strong theme. Let's move on to some mono green. Gwenna, Eyes of Gaea. It stings a little bit that we get to add 2 mana in any combination of colors in a mono green deck, but we're going to want to see what we can get away with by casting creature cards with power 5 or greater to untap this thing. I mean, if we can pay 2 mana for it, it's like we did it for free. If we have enough ways to pump our team, then they will come down with 5 power, and that's one way to achieve it. We can look at cards like Ronus's Monument to make the cards cheaper to begin with so that they get closer to that 2 mana cost. Something like Mirror Superion, ironically enough, works perfectly. Mirror Superion. It took until now to finally meet your bestest pal. What a heartwarming story. You know, if we throw in a few of those effects that let you draw a card every time a creature comes in somehow, I think we can have a really explosive turn with Gwenna. Titania, Nature's Force. I don't think we can talk about Titania Nature's Force without talking about Titania Protector of Argoth. They both deal with elemental creature tokens. One of them cares about forests coming into play. One of them cares about lands going into the graveyard. Lands are going in, lands are coming out, we're making a bunch of elementals, we're milling ourselves. And I had a quick look at other elemental creatures in green to think about an elemental brew, and there's actually a ton of them. Even something like Multani, Yavimai's Avatar, actually works from the graveyard, so it's cool to mill it, even if we don't get to cast it right away. And there's some natural synergy with Splinter Fright here. More milling, and this thing gets pretty huge. Just a big, beefy, classic green deck. Okay, now here's another Titania. This is the Meld one. This is Titania Voice of Gaea. Lands going into the bin gain us life. That's a nice way to preserve our life total while we're milling ourselves fairly aggressively because we want to get 4 or more lands in the graveyard to meld this thing. One of the cards we need to meld is Argoth's Sanctum of Nature. Now, just in case we mill this thing, there's actually a lot of things in green that lets us pull lands back from the graveyard. Regrowth, obviously, but there's a lot of stuff like Grapple with the Past. It mills us even further, and then we can return a creature or a land to our hand. And then if we can have both of them survive to our upkeep, we get to turn it into Titania Gaea Incarnate. This thing is massive. On the board too. It's 2 cards kind of on top of each other, like stacked. It's a big rectangle. We've also been milling a bunch, so we'll probably have a ton of lands in the yard, so the power and toughness will be huge after we bring them all back to the battlefield. Not to mention, now we've got all the mana in the world. We can use that to make a bunch of elementals from lands, and that actually might be the coolest thing to do with this, because here's how the rules work. If anything happens to Titania, the game knows where to put the cards. Titania herself will go back to the command zone, and the land will go into the graveyard. I looked it up. If someone exiles Titania, that land will go into the exile zone instead, so in that case where there's not much we can do about it. But if we're already set up to get lands out of the yard, we can recast our commander, get that land back onto the battlefield, and start all over again. Interestingly enough, we will lose all the lands in our graveyard because they're back onto the battlefield, which is a fine place to have them. So we will have to do a little bit more work to get this going again in the future, until you consider those lands that we made into elementals already. Maybe we don't need to mill too much at that point. Maybe those lands will get to the graveyard the normal way creatures go there, living in that hard magic world. Okay, that's all the monocolored ones. Let's go to the multicolored ones, starting with 2 colors. Harbin, Vanguard, Aviator. So we know white is no stranger to a soldier deck, so I want to see what blue can offer other soldiers. Interestingly enough, my first search turns up that a lot of soldiers in blue are also merfolk soldiers or spirit soldiers, and those ones care more about being a merfolk or being a spirit or something like that. It is a fantastic go wide ability though to make them all bigger and flying. And the neat thing is Harbin doesn't have to attack to do it. We can just cast our 2-mana commander after our board is wide enough and just swing in with a ton of things. Maybe blue isn't there for the soldiers after all. Maybe blue is just there for support like Bident of Thassa to get a whole bunch more card draw. And for redundancy, I think we definitely want Aven Wind Guide. It doesn't pump up our tokens, but now they fly and have vigilance. That's pretty good. Here's another meld. This is Urza, Lord Protector. Makes all our instants, artifacts, and sorcery spells 1 cheaper, and we've got to pay 7 to meld him. We also have to have the Might Stone and the Weak Stone in play. This is an interesting one. The obvious comparison is Dreamstone Hedron because they both tap for 2 colorless, but this one draws you 2 cards right away, whereas Dreamstone Hedron makes you pay more to draw those cards. And you gotta lose it. I think that's worth the 1 extra mana. It's a hefty cost to meld this thing. Your commander's gotta live, that Might Stone and Meek Stone's gotta be pulled out of your deck somehow. And Urza Planeswalker definitely has some fantastic abilities, but I don't know that any of them are the intended point of the deck. They just seem like bonus to me. I think the move is you do an Urza deck, you focus on the cheap artifacts, instants, and sorceries, you have the Might Stone, Weak Stone in there, and if you get them both, great. But I don't think I want to brew around it. Unless we do want to do so for some sort of achievement unlocked kind of thing. Right away, we got another Urza. Urza, Prince of Kroog. This is starting to feel a little bit familiar. We already had Drafna, who makes token copies of artifacts from the stack. Urza makes a copy after it's on the battlefield, but it's a 1/1 soldier creature, which will be a 3/3 because of the ability. I mean, that kind of feels like the set's vibe. A lot of artifacts, a lot of overlap. I guess that's bound to happen. Tough sell for me though, because paying 6 to make a token copy of an artifact is a lot, especially because it's so vulnerable after you do. Although I'm sure there's a few artifacts that cost way more than 6 that this feels like a pretty good discount to do. We just gotta find ways to cheat those ones onto the battlefield. Okay, here's the Mishra meld. Mishra, claimed by Gix. Well, this is pretty cool because you have Mishra, and you gotta have the Phyrexian Dragon engine to meld together. Now the dragon itself has Unearth, so we can aggressively mill to get this dragon engine into our graveyard. Now we can unearth it for 5, and with Unearth, it has haste, so as long as we had Mishra on the board before that happens, we get to attack with both of them, and then meld them. Mishra lost to Phyrexia. This seems like a very strong meld. Way stronger than Urza, I think. We have to choose 3, they have to be different, but there's some powerful things here. And we're also in black-red, so we have access to extra combat things to get extra triggers of this. And if you don't think you can get there necessarily, I think we want to brew this deck so that we're going pretty wide so that when we attack, we've got a lot of creatures to make X pretty big. All right, now here's another Mishra. Mishra, Tamer of Fawa. I think that's the dragon behind him. Now this is a very interesting ability on a commander. Similar to that white soldier one where it just makes it harder for your opponents to interact, but not impossible. I think it's nice design. Sacking a permanent to interact with your stuff is a pretty hefty cost for some decks, which means some decks just won't be able to do anything to you, not without hurting themselves at least as much. The ability to give all your artifact cards Unearth is pretty cool, so I'd want to look for ways to mill ourselves. Giant artifacts that I'm happy to get back for 3, even though I'll only be able to use them for 1 turn. We did a Joyra deck a while back where she was all about casting out gigantic artifacts with tap abilities. That could be a fun way to cheat out some mana. And I think at this cost, perhaps your opponents will be a lot more comfortable if you get a Mindslaver out with this. 3 to unearth it, 4 to activate. Your opponents knowing you can't loop that over and over because the Mindslaver will go into exile might make it a little bit more tolerable. Who knows? Hajar Loyal Bodyguard is very interesting. Gruul Combat Legendaries. I bet you there's a surprising amount of synergy among that category. The fact that Hajar only costs 2 means we can set this up a few times, maybe a lot of times because we're in green and we can afford more commander tax than the average other color. So if you first look at all the legendaries in red and green, it's a soup for sure. But there's a ton of great ones to pick from. Talski, Bearer of Secrets makes combat a profitable thing for you in terms of card draw. Krenko, Tin Street Kingpin just making a bunch of tokens. Maybe Morog to get extra combat steps. Atali, Primal Storm. When it comes to attacking legendaries, Atali might be number 1. But we just set up a pretty wide board. We swing in with everybody. We're prepared to sacrifice Hajar to give them all indestructible and just keep looping this thing. And we've even got a nice ramp package with Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, Marwyn the Nurturer, Rishkar Pima Renegade. I said it before, there's so many playable legendaries now that the average deck has a few in them, and I think Blackblade Reforged goes in a lot more decks than people realize. Plus, There's an old border version of it out now. Queen Kayla bin Kroog. Okay, we got to do some more math. We pay 4 to wheel, and we can potentially get at most 5 mana worth of value back. This does seem strong on the surface. In order to hit a 1, a 2, and a 3, this deck asks us to load up on cheap creatures and artifacts. And I would worry that in Commander, there aren't enough 1, 2, and 3 drop creatures and artifacts that are just impactful enough. Like, that implies you're an aggro deck, but Kayla doesn't help with aggro. She doesn't pump up the team in any way. But this is where I think you gotta look at her a little bit differently. Maybe the goal isn't to hit 3 creatures every time. Maybe instead of loading up with 1, 2, and 3 drop creatures and artifacts, we load up on 1, 2, and 3 drop mana rocks. And there's not a ton that cost 1, but there's tons that cost 2 and 3 if we want. Now every time we wheel, we get a bunch of mana rocks out, hopefully, which allows us to start dropping the big creatures in our deck. So I think I would want to go big creature Boros with this. And that actually sounds pretty cool. Tawnos the Toy Maker. All right, step 1, let's look for beasts and birds that we can get copies of. I think it's overkill, but Crater Hoof Behemoth is a beast. Jorah's Familiar keeps coming up this episode, but that's a bird, so now we can get our historic stuff too cheaper. Protean Hulk is a beast. Now I just had to look up with what Tawnos does, and whenever you cast a beast or a bird, you can copy it. The creatures we search up with Protean Hulk do not get copied. Oh well. And then there's Parcel Beast. This is Mutate. And most of the mutates that are in green and blue are beasts. So we got to think about this like Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief. Ivy says, whenever a player casts a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy, make a copy, and that copy targets Ivy. Ivy is the one changing the target. That's how you get to do double mutates in an Ivy deck. But Tawnos just says you may copy it, except the copy is an artifact in addition to its other types. It doesn't say anything about changing the targets. So if we mutate something like a Parcel Beast onto a non-human, we've targeted that creature. Tawnos makes a copy that also goes on the creature. So we're really only benefiting from things that have triggers that activate when this thing mutates, or that look at how many times it's been mutated. But if we're talking mutate, it's still a fun thing to mutate onto your commander to change the name and type, so it's no longer legendary. So now we can do normal clones and stuff of Tawnos and have multiple things copying beasts or birds every time we cast one. And if that's the game plan, I don't mind copying a Woodland Bellower several times or a Thragtusk several times. Those seem pretty cool. Okay, home stretch. These are the 3 color legendaries. Tawnos Solemn Survivor. I thought this was mono blue, but there's an Esper ability in there, and this is from the commander decks. I do like that Tawnos is a self-contained engine. The ability sacrifices 2 artifact tokens to exile an artifact or creature out of our graveyard and make a token copy of it. That's when we get to use the 2 to create a token copy of that token thing. I mean, if you can get a portal to Phyrexia onto the battlefield and then just copy it every turn, that's going to be pretty brutal. And around here, we love a secret Brutaclad deck by sticking Brutaclad in a bunch of different decks. And this is another thing that cares about tokens. So I bet you this brew would end up using a lot of the list from that. Let's talk about yet another Urza. Urza Chief Artificer, clearly from the commander decks. Affinity for artifact creatures means we can probably engineer a situation where we're only ever paying 3 for Urza. I mean, unless our opponents deal with them a whole bunch of times, but we're going to get around a ton of attacks. Artifact creatures have menace, so we'll want a lot of them. And every end step we make one. That gets bigger, depending on how many artifacts we control. Esper Beatdown. This is interesting. I really like when they give us new commanders that approach a shard or a wedge or something in a new way, but it does feel okay within that color. That seems fine for Esper. Obviously, we're going to want the Karns and other ways to make creatures that get bigger by number of creatures. There's quite a few of those in white. This seems pretty fun. Ashnod the Uncaring. Okay, this is a tricky one. If you use Scryfall, I'm going to put a link in the show notes of the thing you got to type in to get, I think, all the abilities. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a pretty complicated search. I had to look up regular expressions. Anyway, there's some very cool stuff here. The easiest ones on the surface are the ones where the thing sacrifices itself, because obviously that's gonna work. Things like Kuldotha Forge Master, tutoring up 2 things. Ayara, just drawing 2 cards every time we do that. That's pretty nice. And I think there's a really cool thing going on with a Doomed Necromancer. Check this out. We pay a black, we sack the Doomed Necromancer. Since that's part of the cost, that Doomed Necromancer is now in the graveyard. We target something big. We bring it back to the battlefield. But before we do, we got to put a copy of this ability on the stack with Ashnod. And now that copy gets to pick new targets. Guess what? That Doomed Necromancer is now in the graveyard as an eligible target. So now we paid a black and 2 creatures came back. The Necromancer and whatever big thing we wanted. And if we got a 1,000-year elixir out, we can use Doomed Necromancer right away for another black mana and just reanimate our whole graveyard for as much black mana as we have. Not to mention all those entering and dying triggers. That seems fantastic. And of course, like Time Sieve, there's got to be a way to break that, right? Okay, Mishra. Eminent One. More token copies of more things. Now, it's specifically a non-creature. It is on each of our combats, so the temptation is to cast something like Morog and make it into an artifact creature, like with Liquimetal or something. The problem is it's specifically non-creatures, so you can't really do that to get extra copies, to get extra combat steps that way. We gotta do it the hard way. Off the top of my head, I think the easiest move is just little cantrippy artifacts that we can turn sideways now that we've gotten something for them. You know, maybe we draw a card, something like that. Now it's a 4/4 and only costs us 2 mana, but could be something. 2 more from the regular set that are 3 or more color. Tokasha, Dig Site Mentor. Okay, Vigilance on your whole team is very strong in a multiplayer game, so we do get to attack with everybody and use the Surveil ability. We'll probably use that at the end step of the next player's turn. You'll probably want to discard stuff that's not lands, because we're going to pay 8 at sorcery speed, which is costly. I am inclined to want one massive effect if I'm spending 8 rather than a bunch of little ones coming back from the graveyard. But I am positive that there is a few artifact only I win combos that cost 10 mana value or less in the graveyard. Okay, let's close out with the Archimandrite. Advisors, Artificers, and Monk Tribal. Combining types like this that just don't have a home otherwise is very interesting. Please give me Soldiers and Knights Tribals. So I think obviously we want to go really wide because gaining X life and giving everybody plus X plus O is massive. I don't know if you know this, but you can gain a lot of life in Commander. So you look up Monks, Advisors, and Artificers, and it's soup. It's another, there's just creatures that do a lot of different things. The Artificers are unsurprisingly mostly interested in artifacts in one way or another. The Monks and the Advisors seem to be spread out a little less focused. But something like Elshel the Infinite goes pretty good. This is a monk. We get to cast stuff at flash speed from the top of our deck. And let's consider First Strike too, because if we can give a life-linking creature First Strike, that creature will hit, we'll gain the life, and all the other of the specific tribal soup creatures will get that extra boost before their turn to do damage. And something like Rock's Faithmender is a monk who doubles the life gain. We've also got access to Zedru the Great-Hearted to get a little bit of extra life gain every turn, not to mention the card draw. And as long as we can cast 2 spells, OG's letting us gain some life as well. And there's a few branches here. If we're doing life gain in the enchantment route, maybe with auras, we've got Light Paws as a different advisor we could use. Ojutai Exemplars as a monk that just gives themselves First Strike and Lifelink every time we cast a non-creature spell. This seems pretty good. I think there's a lot of potential here. That's a ton. I thought there wasn't that many legendaries, but that's kind of a lot of legendaries. Anyway, let me know in the comments which of these you think are interesting enough and you want us to do an episode on. I'll be doing a few from this set in the near coming weeks. In the meantime, you keep being you. World's a better place for it. We'll see you next time. Oh, remember that Joyra deck I mentioned earlier? She's all about tapping to get counters to put artifacts down for free. If you like doing artifact shenanigans, and honestly, what Commander player doesn't? That's a good episode for you. A bunch of untappers, so we can really jam out some artifacts with very little effort. I hope you like it.